So the panel is called Climate Progress in Unexpected New Terrain. That's probably an understatement, but I don't want to cause alarmism yet. So this is an image that I hope is seared in your mind as to what climate change means in a very practical sense, something that we have already seen in our globe. Historic wildfires on the Pacific Northwest, now we're even seeing them in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. So these are things happening in the here and now. And when we talk about Indiana and climate change, our attitude might be a bit clouded. Why so? Well, here are two views by two very prominent politicians regarding climate change in Indiana. The latest Chicken Little attempt to raise taxes and grow centralized government power. And another statement, humans aren't the cause of global warming. It's something bigger in the universe, such as the sun. That's the kind of attitude that we're dealing with. Now, the good news is both of these comments were made a fair bit of time ago. The first quote was made about 16 years ago. The second quote was made about 8 years ago. I know for certain that the first quote, that person's views have changed over time, but not to where we want them to be. The other piece that may give you a sense of skepticism about whether something can be done meaningfully on climate change in Indiana is the decisions that our legislature has made. Most noteworthy was a decision a couple of sessions ago to become the first state in the United States to eliminate our energy efficiency portfolio standard. We are the first and only state to have eliminated our energy efficiency portfolio standard, which was saving you all money on your energy bills and was cutting the carbon footprint of Indiana. So that's maybe where you're coming to as far as skepticism. But decarbonization of Indiana is happening despite those challenges. Number one, we are seeing lower carbon power plants. Most noteworthy, of course, is Harding Street shutting down, getting replaced by a natural gas, being repowered by natural gas. Now, natural gas has its own set of problems, but from a carbon perspective, we're talking about a 50% decrease on a per unit of energy basis. A second bit of good news, not bit, but meaningful news, is that we have major carbon sinks emerging across Indiana agriculture. It may not be known to the public, but Indiana ranks #1 in the country in cover cropping, which is a very effective technique for establishing carbon sinks in Indiana's agriculturally intensive agricultural economy. The third is a decarbonizing mass transit system. As Dr. Indra Frank brought up in our first panel, Indianapolis had this historic victory for mass transit, which will lead to the first all-electric bus rapid transit line in the United States, here in Indiana. Great, great thing. Now, I've given you good news about the fact that Indiana has been on this march towards decarbonization, but here we are entering a perilous turbulence for climate progress. Now, the irony is that it's all premised on the fact that somehow we have this immense fossil fuel sector in Indiana, but that's actually not true. This is a map produced by Indiana University that shows that even the most coal-intensive parts of our state have a very small percentage of their jobs attributed to coal. It's about 3,000. That's not to diminish the importance of those jobs for the families that depend upon those jobs, but it's 3,000 jobs versus 18,000 jobs that were attributed to the energy efficiency portfolio standard that was eliminated 2 sessions ago. That's perspective we need to have. Now, here's the challenge. One is the danger of the Clean Power Plan getting eliminated, something I brought up in my introductory remarks. Secondly is the unleashing of drilling on public lands and the green lighting of the Keystone XL pipeline and the green lighting of the Dakota Access pipeline. These things will not only lead to a surge in natural gas and oil production in America, but would increase our carbon footprint as well as hurt the economics of renewable energy. And then finally, I want you to be aware of this very controversial piece of public policy that's been introduced in Congress year after year. It's called the RAINS Act. And the idea is that if a regulation has a $10 million impact on America, which is a pretty minuscule amount over a $11 trillion economy, then Congress has the ability to vote on that regulation. And if they fail to vote in favor of it, the regulation dies. So this will drastically reduce the independence of the US EPA, which I remind you was born thanks to leadership from both Republicans and Democrats in 1970. Now, these trends collectively could greatly damage American climate progress and global progress, just as at the time that we were accelerating our progress in climate action. Where is the hope? And I'll segue then to introducing Jamie and Trish here. The hope is that solar energy has gone down dramatically, 70% over a 6-year period. Energy efficiency is by far the cheapest way to fulfill our energy needs, as you can see in this chart. Nationally, we do see prospects of defending renewable energy incentives like the production tax credit, and there's even talk among Republicans and Democrats of advancing the carbon tax, something that the Citizens Climate Lobby has been a key leader on. At the state level, there is prospect of defending and expanding what's called energy freedom, the notion of empowering you to produce your energy from solar, something that Sierra Club and Citizens Action Coalition and HEC and Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light are among the groups that are fighting for, and to advance the cause of energy efficiency at the state level. And then there is an inspirational new movement that Earth Charter Indiana has really led to build up climate and sustainability leaders among our mayors. So these are very, very positive trends. Yes. And this leads us to our two panelists, right on time here. I'm honored to introduce Jamie Ponce from the Environmental Law and Policy Center, which I'm a proud alum, and then Trish Demeter, our sister from the Ohio Environmental Council, where she's the managing director of clean energy, and Jamie is the new director of innovation for ELPC. So we'll introduce Jamie first. Thank you.
You know, as grateful as I am to Jesse and all of the staff at HEC, and as humbled as I am to stand in front of such a crowd today of bright-eyed, committed people, I have no illusions about why you're here. It's not really about the folks on stage. It's about connecting with neighbors. It's about telling our stories. And it's about finding inspiration to keep up action. So I'd like to invite you to think for just a second about a time in the last week when you've either felt connected to or concerned about our environment. And don't think about the connection or the concern so much as where you were when you had those thoughts. And now I'd love to invite you to turn to a person next to you and in one sentence, just tell them where you were. Where were you when you felt connected? Where were you when you felt concerned? It could have been in a park, it could have been in an office, it could have been in a car. Where were you? The great thing about stories is that they tend to build on themselves, but I'm going to stop you right there. And the reason I ask you to focus on place is that climate change can be so big. You see that picture of the planet, you think of faraway places, and climate policy can seem so abstract, where there's jargon and rhetoric, and it can be tough to engage. But at its heart, climate change is about places. And climate change policy helps set the rules that shape those places. Chances are, whatever place you just described had some element of nature. Clean air, clean water, trees, transportation. Maybe you were in a building, the built environment. Those are all shaped by climate policy. So as we move into a discussion about the climate arena and what we're doing to mitigate climate change and adapt to the changes that are already before us, please think of them in terms of those real places where we live and work and thrive. Now, as Jesse shared, I'm the Director of Innovation at the Environmental Law and Policy Center. We are a team of more than 40 lawyers and business people and policy experts in Chicago and 10 field offices across the US. Earlier today, Kim Ferraro shared a pie chart of lawyers and their focus areas. And there was a tiny little sliver of public advocacy and environmental lawyers. That's where ELPC sits. We're among the Midwest's dedicated public interest groups that are working towards clean energy, transportation, air, water, and special spaces. I'd also like to share a little bit about where we work and why that's important. ELPC focuses on 9 states across the Midwest, from the Dakotas to Ohio. And this has personal connection to me. I grew up in Milwaukee. I went to college at IU in Bloomington. And Chicago's been home now for the last 15 years. But even more than that, or our stories, the Midwest is a pivotal region in the country and in the world. Across these 9 states, we have almost 60 million residents, which is 18% of US population. We have more than 500,000 square miles of land, 15% of total land area. We're at the transportation crossroads of the country. We are America's breadbasket. And you don't need anything more compelling than the election last week to demonstrate the political importance of the Midwest. There were 4 states, Ohio, Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, that all flipped from Democrat to Republican from the 2012 to the 2016 election. And they represented 50 electoral votes. That would have changed the president. There were also 4 of the most closely watched Senate races were in Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. Had 3 of those 4 gone in a different direction, we'd have a different Senate. And at the state legislative houses, there was a shift, a 47-seat pickup by Republicans across our state houses. The Midwest is significant, the Midwest is powerful, and what we do here really matters. Jesse talked a little bit about the national policy landscape. He touched on the Clean Power Plan. He mentioned the wind and solar tax credits. Federal policy controls fuel efficiency standards, and federal law helps protect clean air and clean water. I won't go into detail on these since Jesse touched on them before, but as a ray of hope, I don't give a lot of presentations with pictures of Richard Nixon, and I haven't given one yet with a picture of Donald Trump. But even though things are looking a little bleaker for environmental advocacy at the federal level, it's helpful to me to remember that Richard Nixon, of all presidents, founded the EPA in 1970, signed the Clean Air Act in 1970, and signed the Clean Water Act, the major amendment, in 1972. Sometimes people surprise us, and it's important to stay engaged. At the national level, there really is hope. The 2016 presidential election was one of the first in recent memory that made infrastructure investment a central campaign issue. President-elect Trump said that he would double Hillary Clinton's proposed $275 billion in infrastructure spending. I don't know whether and how that will come to pass, but the fact is, infrastructure directly impacts our energy system, our transportation system, which are responsible for the vast majority of GHG emissions. When we think about infrastructure, there's a wide range of projects where we can invest our advocacy and our time and our hope. One, President Obama just a couple of weeks ago announced 48 national EV charging infrastructure corridors, several of which run through Indiana, really unlocking potential of electric vehicles which, if charged with clean energy, will absolutely transform emissions from the transportation sector. Infrastructure investment can also take the form of high-speed rail, low carbon, accessible, convenient transportation that connects our not just cities, but rural areas too. And if you think of all the people who live within a 50-mile radius of Indianapolis, and all the people who live within a 50-mile radius of St. Louis, and you imagine the power of high-speed rail connecting our regional hubs like Indy, Columbus, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago, Minneapolis, and the people outside of those cities who can be served by high-speed rail connecting to each other, that's actually great reason for hope. But certainly, when you thought about your connection or your concerns about the environment, you probably weren't thinking about the State House. You probably weren't thinking about, well, you might have been thinking about the candidates' positions on infrastructure. But there's a whole nother realm that's coming into even sharper focus, with national campaigns having been run that really set out some destructive language, destructive goals when it comes to environmental conservation and natural resources. Our states, and even more so, our cities and counties and municipal government offer a very bright opportunity for near-term climate action, regardless of how you feel about the presidential or the national congressional elections. Before I was with ELPC, I spent nearly 5 years in Mayor Emanuel's office in the city of Chicago, working through the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. C40 is a global effort among more than 85 big cities working together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to manage the negative impacts of climate change. Chicago was one of those 85 cities, and C40 is really predicated on the idea that we don't have to wait on nations to take action on climate. Chicago was an example of that back in 2008 when the city adopted an ambitious climate action plan right at the same time that it was apparent that Congress nationally wasn't going to sign on to the Kyoto Protocol. City of Chicago and other local leaders across the US began to say, well, what if we just move forward? We may not control national infrastructure and budgets, but cities and communities are where the people are. Cities and communities are where many of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, where our resources are, and where our ideas are. So cities really are a hopeful engine and a source of solutions on climate. Chicago, like many other cities, set out ambitious goals of greenhouse gas emission reduction of 25% by 2020, 80% by 2050, and then went through a process of figuring out how to live up to those goals. And through C40, with Chicago and all of those cities around the world, there was really a framework that I found helpful to think about where to dig in, how to make climate policy real locally. And that's first to think about what cities, counties, municipalities own and operate. As actors in the economy, cities control fleets of vehicles. Think of all the vehicles that collect waste, that take care of the transportation infrastructure, that service parks and open spaces, that move city officials around. Think of all the buildings that cities and municipalities operate, and the chances not just for energy efficiency to reduce energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, but also to make better use of the taxpayer money that pays for those bills. So as you think about the cities and counties and municipalities where you live, think about all the systems that they control and operate. Moving across this spectrum, cities and counties also have direct regulatory power, not just over the transportation, the buildings, the public spaces that they own and operate, but across the private sector as well. Think about municipal codes, which often include energy codes. Think about the ability that cities have to pass location-specific solutions like congestion pricing, or to regulate stormwater management or freshwater provision. And then finally, cities have enormous power to nudge and to celebrate and to recognize and to plan. And some cities are doing this through things like smart cards in public transit, by recognizing green businesses, by soliciting green businesses to move to their communities and helping to tell that story, by planning and creating clean tech clusters, by talking about the environment, by not necessarily tree hugging, but by positioning our communities as great places to live, great places to work, and places that thrive without harming the environment. I just wanted to speak quickly to a great example of local inaction, which is the CityEnergy Project. It's a joint effort by NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Institute for Market Transformation. This program launched in 2012, and it now covers 20 cities across the US, not just clustered in the coasts, not just clustered in Democratic strongholds, but in places like Atlanta, in Des Moines, Iowa, in Fort Collins, Colorado, in Kansas City, in Reno, in Salt Lake, in St. Louis, in Orlando, in Pittsburgh, manufacturing towns, service industry towns. These cities actually cut a swath right across the middle of the country. And this program engages mayors, engages city officials, engages the business community to think about energy use in buildings, which can represent up to 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in cities, and on which cities spend billions of dollars a year to heat and cool and operate buildings throughout. The CityEnergy Project takes a local approach to assessing and planning specific policy interventions like building energy benchmarking and transparency, which basically amounts to calculating a miles per gallon rating for building energy use. They look at things like building operator certification, which really amounts to creating good jobs and upskilling of the people who operate these buildings. Engineers, building managers, technicians. CityEnergy Project looks at energy codes and compliance, how those codes are enforced, as well as energy-aligned leases and incentives that sometimes get in the way of efficiency. And maybe most of all, CityEnergy Project prompts cities to lead by example, by getting their own homes in order, by cleaning up codes, by creating the right incentives, by recognizing energy efficiency progress. More broadly, whether it's through the CityEnergy Project or other efforts, cities banding together, communities banding together, counties banding together, create great opportunities to make public commitments, to take stock of threats and opportunities, to set concrete targets, and to plan to take specific climate action. And really, in terms of where we go from here, there are plenty of political scientists, there are plenty of news commentators who are trying to figure out exactly what happened in the national elections last week. But in the meantime, we live in real communities, and these communities are going forward. And we have a chance to look forward, not backward, in really understanding what matters most to our neighbors, employers, and policymakers, thinking critically about our messaging, and aligning our climate and environmental values with economic and social and political values. Building a fact base, knowing what's going on to identify concrete opportunities, going after those opportunities and celebrating them publicly when we win. And most of all, supporting each other. So going back to where we started, think again about that place where you were when you felt connected or you felt concerned. And think about the ways that policy, whether it was national, state, or most likely local, shaped the place you were, shaped how you got to where you were, shaped the water you were drinking, the air you were breathing. And I'll look forward to continuing the conversation as we go into Q&A.
Thank you, Jamie. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Trish Demeter. I do manage the energy programs for the Ohio Environmental Council, which is a lot like the Hoosier Environmental Council. We have an energy program, a natural resources program, a law center, so we have some litigators for defending the environment, and also a campaigns and communications center. I'm going to talk to you today about building coalitions to in-state level policy work in order to advance climate solutions, and to focus my discussion today on telling you a story about a 4-year-long battle for Ohio's clean energy standards. And I'm coming to you today, within a couple of weeks we will potentially have a resolution on this issue. But I wanted to, there's a lot of coalition work that can be done and that we've done in Ohio, but our story about the clean energy standards is one I think that we've learned a lot of lessons, and I'd love to share with you our journey there. But first, a little bit about Ohio. We are a state that has a deregulated environment. It's a little different from Indiana, so we do have competitive markets for electricity generation. Customers can shop for where they buy their electricity from. We have a heavy coal state, as you can see from this chart up here. Just under 60% is coming from coal-fired power, about a quarter of that from natural gas. Our renewables is right around 2%. It kind of fluctuates a little bit. And we have a state renewable and energy efficiency standard that were established in 2008. It's 12.5% for renewables by the year 2025 and 22.5% energy savings by the year 2025. And we do have fairly positive net metering rules in Ohio, so customers who do want to self-generate and put rooftop solar up or a small wind project, they can work with their utility and get that done. So Ohio's story starts about this time 4 years ago, where there was a lame duck amendment that was floating around in the state legislature to repeal the energy efficiency standard. We won. We were able to hold off that amendment, but shortly after the new General Assembly started in 2013, Senate Bill 58 was proposed. It was death by 1,000 cuts to Ohio's clean energy standards. It did not repeal them, but it died in committee late that year. So it only lasted a year, but what a year it was. In 2014, because that bill was defeated or died in committee, the General Assembly came back in early 2014 and said, we're going to freeze the standards. It was supported by the big three, the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and the governor of our state, to put a hold and to take a timeout on Ohio's clean energy standards and figure it out what was going to be a cost-effective energy policy for the state of Ohio. So they created an energy mandate study committee that was supposed to look into the issue and have testimony, bring in, witnesses, and to have a discussion about what was going to be a cost-effective energy policy for the state of Ohio. But you can see from the title here, Energy Mandate Study Committee, you kind of saw that it was a predetermined outcome, and that is when that committee issued its report, the best solution for energy policy in Ohio is to just kick the can down the road and extend the freeze in Ohio's clean energy. And so through this story, I don't want to dig into the policy too much because it's a long and road that will make you all sleep after your wonderful lunch. But I do want to talk about the evolution of our coalition over this same time frame. And why did this happen? Why did we go from having great clean energy standards that were delivering exactly what they promised to deliver, lower electricity bills, clean energy jobs, both energy efficiency and renewables, cleaner air. We saw great carbon reductions, other criteria pollutants that cause things like asthma. And so we had some adversaries, and I liken it to three forces at play. One, we have utilities in this restructured environment that are suffering. They are losing money in those competitive wholesale markets because they made really bad bets on coal-fired power at a time when the rest of the world was moving towards clean energy. So they were suffering some revenue issues, and energy efficiency undercuts their profits. We also saw large industrials in the state. We are, like Indiana, a lot of heavy manufacturing in our state, and those industrials were not too happy about having to pay for energy efficiency on their electric bill, so they were pushing for an opt-out, an industrial opt-out. And then we also had political ideologies that were really driving this crusade against wind energy in the state of Ohio. And at the same time, in a budget bill, I see my spelling error there. I was an English lit major, so that bothers me. Sorry about that. B-I-L. It was a B-I-L-L, and it was a bill that there was an amendment to a budget bill that actually increased the setback distances for where you could put wind turbines from neighboring property lines and occupied buildings, which effectively zoned out large-scale wind energy in Ohio. And since that was passed in 2014, we haven't seen any new large-scale wind developed in Ohio. And and it is a shame. On a day like today in Northwest Ohio, we could be reaping the benefits of renewable energy for sure. So those were our adversaries. So we built a coalition on purpose to respond to our adversaries and respond to the political reality that we were dealing with. And we had a lot of evolution over time, as you can imagine. Players come and go, but we decided very early on in this battle to stay together and to work together in a certain way. And there were many levels of our coalition, and I cannot take credit whatsoever for a lot of the names that are up here, but I wanted to show you the work of this coalition. Not just me, but many, many others brought together and brought out some very recognizable names in business. For a Republican legislature and a governor who won't meet with lobbyists but will meet with CEOs of companies, we knew that the business voice was going to be so incredibly important to fighting on this issue. So we have the Ohio Energy Table, which was one layer of our coalition, environmentalists and faith organizations. We have Ohio Interfaith Power and Light, which is a great partner of ours. And we also have had really wonderful partnerships with the business community as well. But I wanted to get into the really some of the lessons learned through this coalition. Throughout the evolution of our coalition, we had to have multiple discussions about what are our deal breakers. What are our bottom lines? What do we care about? Do you really care about a mandate, or do you care about the performance of a mandate? Is it more important to get that carbon reduction than it is to have the mechanism of a portfolio standard? And we had to be very honest with ourselves about what that looked like. And we had to decide at certain times whether or not we're going to negotiate together, or if it was okay for some of us to peel off and make a deal. And that strategy, it's as much to do with strategy as it does with setting expectations and being very honest with one another on, I don't want to end up at the end of this calling you a sellout. So I want to make sure you know that I am willing to make a deal. And maybe if I'm going to make a deal, you can just go out there publicly and you can shame me for doing the deal. And later on tonight, we'll go and meet and have a beer and we'll be fine with it. But we had to be very honest with what that looked like. Will you be seen together? It sounds a little harsh, but we had to talk about, will any portion of our coalition be seen as publicly aligned arm in arm? Or will we work behind the scenes and essentially be all working towards the same goal, but maybe publicly have nothing to do with one another? And that was very important for certain members of our coalition to ensure that that publicly facing connection was never made for strategic purposes. We had to allow the different levels of coalition. And I like to tell this one example. I know I only have a couple of minutes, but one example is a new player that came onto the scene in 2015 called the Ohio Conservative Energy Forum. They were an organization that was formed based on a model in Indiana and Texas, or Oklahoma, I can't remember, one of the western states. And they have a leadership council that includes the Christian Coalition, Ohio Right to Life, College Republicans, and that forum came out in support of required standards on electric utilities to invest in renewables and efficiency. And while there were some members of the coalition that got a little, uncomfortable with some of those allies, what was important is that that organization was able to soften the opposition in a way that I don't think any of our environmental or other partners could have done, not even some of the business partners could have done, because they had that credible voice with our audience that we're trying to move. How will you control your story? This one was hard. For us advocates that we have really like to see a quote in the paper, we actually had a couple of periods of time throughout this campaign where a reporter would call me and I would say, I can talk to you on background, don't quote me, call this business. and get a quote from them. And that business may not have a media relation person at all, and I would call them and I would say, this reporter's gonna call you, here's maybe what you should say. You know, you didn't hear it from me. But that's hard because our funders, especially for us that have nonprofit associations, you know, our funders like to see those newspaper articles where we're quoted. But it was very deliberate because we did not want the reporters making the story about, you know, our libertarian, very conservative legislature against the greenies, because we never win that argument. And so it had to be businesses against businesses, and it had to be about jobs, it had to be about energy savings. And so we had to it was hard, but we had to be very disciplined about what that story looked like. So I'll leave you with that. I really am excited to hear the questions. This is a really exciting group. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie and Trish, and really some powerful takeaways here that provide us hope. At the city level, the power of cities in terms of their budgets, in terms of their legal authority, the prospect of policy change in a comparably conservative state as Ohio. Let's get questions from everybody. Please raise your hand. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Okay. Does Ohio have a state climate resiliency plan to prepare for federal climate resiliency? And I think if you hit the bottom, yeah. Okay, thanks.
We do not have a state climate resiliency plan, but many of our major cities do. Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Dayton, Ohio, and I believe Toledo all have some level of climate adaptation or climate resiliency plans. Our state portfolio standards are so critical because we're a state that has 11 million people. Even our modest 12.5% renewable and 22% was getting us massive economies of scale in terms of carbon and other pollutant reductions. So I like to think of that as our main contribution, and we have a lot of work to do on transportation, but our state clean energy standards were very important to fighting climate change.
Thank you, Trish. Question for Jamie. With respect to the CityEnergy Project, were cities chosen? What's the criteria? Can cities be added? And what's the overall mission?
Great, thank you. So the CityEnergy Project that I mentioned in my presentation started with 10 cities that were announced in 2012. It was a competitive process where cities applied. I was actually part of the team that applied from the city of Chicago to be part of CityEnergy Project, and then have worked with them and advised the group over the years. Just within the last few weeks, the project expanded to 10 additional cities. So they're welcoming more into the fold. And the criteria that went into selection for CityEnergy Project was based on local opportunity and potential to focus on winning policies. In applying from Chicago, we had to demonstrate that we could put together a coalition of government and business and nonprofit leaders who cared about energy, who saw something in it for them. And CityEnergy Project put us through the ringer in terms of inventorying all of the buildings across the city of Chicago, thinking about average energy performance of those buildings, and then thinking really critically about where the opportunities and the barriers were. In Chicago, we identified concrete policies like the Chicago Energy Benchmarking and Transparency Ordinance. That's the miles per gallon rating equivalent for buildings. We zeroed in on building operator certification because, like most cities, we're really concerned about creating good 21st century jobs. And we really doubled down on voluntary leadership, creating opportunities, creating brightly lit platforms for for municipal, residential, commercial buildings to improve their energy performance. And we really needed, we worked with CityEnergy Project. They helped us create models. They provided inspiration in terms of policies. There is potential for CityEnergy Project to expand over time. Like I just mentioned, they've doubled in size. They do have a public website. It's cityenergyproject.org, and you can read about the recent announcements. But more importantly, groups like CityEnergy Project, groups like the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, groups like the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group are all about lesson sharing. So even for cities that may not be formally part of CityEnergy Project or any of those other groups, part of the value, part of the big learning is creating venues where city officials, where members of communities can share what's working. Because when it comes down to it, cities face a lot of the same challenges, whether they're on the West, East, or West Coast, East Coast, or Midwest.
Great, thank you, Jamie. Question next, probably best suited for Trish. Making the economic case against coal is simple, natural gas a bit less so. What's your go-to argument against investments in gas?
That's a hard one because part of our program is to combat fracking in the state of Ohio. It's a big deal on the eastern and southern part of our state. It depends on the audience. Honestly, it has to be, think about what do you really want to win that argument with someone who is from, a very important oil and gas part of the state. So for certain legislators, I will talk about Ohio needs a diversified energy portfolio. We need to have, just like an investment fund, we need to have our investments scattered throughout all these resources, and we need to let the least cost resources rise to the top. But we can't get over leveraged, and we don't want to make the same mistake that we did with coal as with natural gas. Yes, it's cheap and abundant now, but it won't always be. And if we put all of our money in all of our investment in building new natural gas plants, we're going to be in the same exact spot in 30 or 40 years that we are today. And we're looking at uneconomic natural gas plants in a wholesale market that is much more distributed. Centralized power stations are becoming a thing of the past. Distributed generation is the future, and we're seeing those trends are unstoppable no matter what the policy is. So we need to make sure that our state policy supports that. So I think with other audiences, with our activists, it's like, hell no natural gas. Let's go all renewables. It's the best path forward. So I think it depends on your audience.
And I might just add to that quickly. Natural gas is very cheap. But natural gas-fired power plants are extremely expensive, extremely long-lived assets in an area where what regional transmission organizations are asking for and local distribution utilities need most is flexibility. And distributed generation, just as Trish was sharing, provides that flexibility. And we are seeing new technologies like batteries and other advanced energy storage come within reach, if not today, within the next 2 to 5 years, that could really change the economic calculations on long-lived fossil fuel-fired generating capacity. Jesse showed us the curve of the precipitous decline in solar costs. Wind has done that even sooner, even sharper. Which really puts the onus on energy efficiency, which can help defer the need to build those big gas-fired plants now, buy us the time to allow renewables costs, energy storage costs to come down so that we can make truly the best, lowest cost, level playing field decisions about our power system.
Great, thank you. We're going to go a little lightning round here since we have a lot of questions, but sticking with you, Jamie, here for a second. Chicago is the windy city. What is it going to take for there to be more wind power in the windy city?
That's a good one, especially as I drove down I-65 past your beautiful wind farms on the way here. Wind power within the city does exist. It tends to be more for show. There's a method manufacturing plant, Green Household Cleaning Materials, that has a giant wind turbine just off of the Bishop Ford. There are other demonstration turbines in town. Cities probably aren't the best place for wind power, but where Chicago has been investing on the renewable front is in reducing barriers to solar. Rooftop solar, solar gardens, community solar, where we have brownfields, where we have warehouse rooftops. We love those wind turbines, and it always makes it a pleasure to drive down to Indianapolis through those fields. But I think we certainly want to enable all options to play on a level playing field for energy.
Great, thank you. Next question, animal agriculture, and I think I'll take a crack and answer this question. Animal agriculture is known to be the #1 contributor to climate change. When and how can we make this a priority, or at least get acknowledged by environmental policymakers? Thank you for the question. For those who are not aware, our work at the Hoosier Environmental Council is very focused on factory farms, and we very much appreciate documentary films like Cowspiracy that have brought to light just how profound the carbon footprint of animal agriculture is. And we are working on this issue from multiple prongs, litigation through the work that Kim Ferrara, our senior staff attorney, is leading, technical assistance that Kim and Indra in particular are getting involved in, legislative advocacy as well. So the issue here is not to end livestock agriculture. The issue is to dramatically reduce its carbon footprint. Another means of doing that is through adopting resolutions like Meatless Mondays, which our organization has signed off on, and I hope our brothers and sisters and other environmental groups sign up for that too. So let's keep moving. And again, if you've got any other questions on climate change, please head up this way. We only have a few more minutes left. Okay. All right. Let's get to the issue of climate change per se. How do you deal? What's your tips, again, very, very concisely, for dealing with climate deniers? Very concisely.
Well, we're about a week and a half after the election, so my tone is changing just a little bit. But I say, it doesn't really matter what you believe. It doesn't change the facts. And I think you just have to put it aside as quickly as you can. I don't know that there's really a whole lot of debate. I'm not going to spend any more time debating science and debating facts. I'm going to, work actually as fairly but as toughly as I can to put those folks and their, their skepticism and their denial aside, and just get straight back to what the solutions are and why we need to act right now.
And I think many of us here would echo. You're all in the room. We've all read the science. We believe the science. We've all looked at the numbers and believe in the numbers. And I think there's a really strong emerging moral argument around climate change as well. Whether they're caused by humans or not, the changes we're seeing in the climate disproportionately affect the people who are least equipped to deal with it. It's people in developing countries, it's the poor, and that's a moral issue. But if you don't believe in science, you don't believe in economics, and you don't believe in morality, we can still talk customer choice, we can still talk about transparent, competitive markets, and we can still talk about lowest cost solutions.